reconstruction. And the group that won the competition and were appointed as master planners for the reconstruction was brought together by Ian Simpson and largely led by the group at that time called EDOR. And the person who took up the largest part of that burden on EDOR's behalf and really made Manchester his paint box for as long as it took, which is a time between hang gliding in South America, as I recall, was a very active man who's just come to join us this afternoon, and that's Jason Pryor.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So I was going to talk about some elements of the master plan. It's in the right place. And then what Yassi had asked me to do was sort of point at some lessons learned that we then took elsewhere in the world. I spent the last 10 years charging around the world like a headless chicken doing this in other places. So, but from my career perspective, it all certainly started here. So you've probably seen, I'm sorry I wasn't here this morning, but you've seen lots of images of the bomb-damaged area, the zone we all had to work with. As was said, you know, a competition was put together really quite quickly. I had been at college in Manchester from the late 70s to the mid-80s. It's a town very close, city very close to my heart, but stepping back into the city as someone who was based in London, I kind of had to make a series of both emotional and professional links. I was very fortunate to meet up with Jim Chapman, Ian Simpson and Roger and others. So a sort of network of people came together pretty quickly, orchestrated locally, I think, by Jim and Ian, which was a way of putting a team together that had both experience in city planning, but critically, and I think this goes to some of the earlier conversations, had a deep knowledge of the city and what was to be worked on. Ultimately, what I found as somebody coming in essentially from the outside was basically a sense of outrage that anyone could have done this to this city at this time. And as I've heard some of the conversations today, you know, and I say this in the nicest possible way, in a highly opinionated city with multiple views, here was a point where everyone said, right, this will be a point of collective coming together, we will sort this out. And of course, there were some fundamental urban design issues that lay within the city, as we saw the image on the right of sorry, you can't see it, I can, sorry, of the Shambles shopping centre, you know, our scheduled ancient monument that was now had an underground car park underneath it, wrapped in concrete. There were issues of both historic urban design intervention, but critically, I think from where we were seeing it as well, a real risk of flight of capital from the city centre. You know, if we actually just think back to what was going on then, the city centre was in a pretty dire situation. We had very few residents living in the city centre. We had whole shopping centres and office blocks that were abandoned. The Arndale had a less than joyful reputation. We had areas where Exchange Square and the Print Works and the Corn Exchange now are, which were effectively dead. And areas that really hadn't moved on for really quite a long time. So there were structural issues, and there was also the Trafford Shopping Centre nearing completion and in the middle of a letting program. So as the retailers in the city centre lost their places of operation, the temptation to flee out of town was absolutely enormous. And then, of course, you had the insurance industry, which was basically saying, we don't want to cover everyone for their shops being closed. Let's get this rebuilt fast and get everyone back in there because we're not paying for this. And that was a pretty heady mixture for the city leadership to basically pour oil on troubled waters and say, okay, calm down, we need to look at this properly. And the first thing I think the city did, which was extraordinary, was to buy time. Time for thinking. It may not have been as much time as people wanted, but it was the time required to stand back, think about this, consult pretty widely, and then put a mechanism in place from which you could go forward. And that mechanism we were all part of. We kind of represent, the guys here, the design response to that. but there was a huge strategic and tactical response around finance, city planning ordinance, the need to upgrade services while the city was in pieces, rethinking the bus systems, where's the tram going to go. It was a moment in time to think big and draw a lot of threads together. It was an opportunity that could be taken. The other thing I think I would say is that the city had a really great advantage at this time, which we possibly don't reflect on enough, that with the work that had taken place in Hume, the work that had taken place around the Crescents, if people remember those, you actually had a team in the city who'd kind of done this before. They knew how to handle a big civic project. You know, I reckon most of the cities in the country, if this had happened, it would have been a complete disaster. Despite some of the criticisms I've heard today, the city team they haven't done anything this big, but they were in an extraordinary position to pick the baton up and run with it. This was a team that knew how to do things. I've just spent the morning in a meeting with a large group of them. It's the same people. The experience in the city is extraordinary. It is a team like any other you can point to in the country at the moment. And that ability to have a steady hand, know what the mechanisms were like, and approach this project in a calm way, I think was very important. So you all know the area. You know, to me, you can distill this plan down to one simple move, and that was New Cathedral Street. So at the end of the day, the breaking through of the old shambles development and the Cathedral Street link from the bottom of St Anne's Square down to the cathedral, and in effect that 150 metre, 200 metre link through the city, in effect provided the reconnection with the cathedral in the old heart of the city, a link back to the prestigious piece that was St Anne's. And what fell out of that in our highway structure, Deansgate across, was a scale of city block that was appropriate for the city centre, allowed us, and Ian will probably talk to you about this, to deliver a series of buildings which were of the appropriate scale for the city centre. Nothing was bigger than the old Royal Exchange. We got lucky to some extent. There was that one simple move that was actually, despite all the pain, relatively easy to deliver, and a lot of things fell out of that. And I have to say, in my work, that's what you go looking for when you're reconstructing cities, is where's the key? Which is the one that really unlocks stuff? And I think you could distill this whole plan down to that link. A lot of hard work took place around that, but with that link, the creation of Exchange Square, and a mission about creating places for people as opposed to let's just rebuild the same amount of floor space, was really the mantra, I think. The city were extraordinarily voiced for us, and I think with their public consultation process, is about the need to make this a livable piece of city. Let's remember back 20 years, no-go area after night, not that many people hanging around in town. We've heard about the bars and clubs of the Northern Quarter earlier. This was not cafe culture in the city centre, anything but. There was a need to, as it were, create places for people to hang out, to enjoy, to, in effect, start to anticipate the way city centres have been changing around both retail and entertainment. You can see the same thing has happened in Liverpool, same things happened in London, same things happened in New York. There was a sea change going on in many Western cities, and Manchester was right up front around a lot of that. You know, things had to be done, so those are the pubs broken up, redivided scheme that Ian did a lot of work on. You know, I've heard criticisms of this over the years. We Disneyfied our historic buildings, we played around with the area by the cathedral. Well, maybe, but you know, we got solutions. And I would, listening to some of the conversations earlier, I would just like to hold up this flag about just imagine what the financial and political pressure was in the background from the big insurance companies and the big landowners and central government when you've got a city centre in this state. It's an enormous amount of pressure. It's a drumbeat in the background that you kind of have to override, but bear in mind what was going on and when it was going on. Martha will talk about Exchange Square later. I'm sure she will say warm things about the space, but I'll leave her to. Critical thing about Exchange Square, though, was really creating space out of road space. and this was just a major road junction. How do you close a road down? Well, it sounds simple. You then got to reconfigure all the traffic that was using that road, reconfigure bus stations. So the other point I'd like to make about any interventions in cities is you start pulling on a thread, you never know when it's going to end. So for the technocrats on one hand, what does that mean? I remember this was an A road. You ever tried stopping up an A road under British planning law? You know, take a deep breath before you start. So even making these minor interventions, and Jim touched on this a little bit earlier about the complexity of playing in the English city street scene, this was a big deal. And the whole time, whilst you're doing that, just alive to the fact that at the end of the day, this is a sort of socio-economic challenge. You know, many of us come from a design background, but you know, more and more I spend working on cities. It's a socio-economic problem. It's about the economy of place. It's what people want. It's about being able to attract people in. And then critically in most plans is not over-prescribing the outcomes. If you know, the over-planned city is usually a complete disaster. We've heard about the sort of dull, grey places. I think the constant challenge, and it was a challenge here, was almost how little can you do to provoke a reaction that people will take ownership of. If you tell everyone exactly where to sit, exactly where to stand, exactly where to have a coffee, well, that's all you get. But if you leave the doors open. So the flower market and the antiques markets that we would see in St. Anne's Square post the reconstruction, they were on no plan. But what was on the plan was a space for places for people to do things. Piccadilly Gardens flowed on fairly soon after that, not least because the economic success of the rebuild in the city centre had dragged all of this economic activity away from Piccadilly Gardens. Again, let's remember the whole area around Piccadilly was very poor retail, poor hotels, very poor office development, and that got a lot worse very quickly as the bomb-damaged area was reconstituted. This also coincided, of course, with the replanning of the tram systems, road systems, so the regeneration of that space. Again, Martha will talk about Exchange Square, but you know, lessons learned from this one is, you know, when you design spaces, there was a huge pressure to keep green space. Remember the big trade we had to do to bring a building in order to liberate the space in the first place, but creating the space that people can use and then having the money and the wherewithal to look after it. And then understanding what that space is about. I remember on the opening day, one of the city managers came up to me and said, it's all right, I've just chased the kids out the fountain, we'll have no trouble. And you think, well, actually, the reason it's got a ramp into it is so everyone can get in the fountain. And therefore, you know, it's a space that was supposed to be abused and used. And, you know, we didn't anticipate the kids who very quickly worked out that if you held an empty Coke can upside down over the really big fountain head in the middle, and as long as you could hold on for about 10 seconds, the thing would go to about 150 feet. We hadn't thought that one through. I agree we hadn't thought that one through. But, you know, I've told this story before, but my favorite moment from that was just watching a family get off the bus, walk up to the fountain, get their deck chairs out, open up their picnic hamper, whip the nappies off their toddlers and throw them in the fountain. At that point, you just thought, okay, we're done. You know, that works. Again, it's not in the script, it's not in the anticipation, but it's in the ownership of the places you create. And talking about ownership, that was the Rangers fans, I think, that one. Just the most extraordinary occupation of space. And then, of course, the litter clearance afterwards. And people always say, I remember showing a guy around from Museum of Modern Art in New York. So Martha and I, there was an exhibition going on, and we were 2005. So anyway, the curator of the exhibition came across to see what we'd all been up to, wanted to exhibit this, and I was walking him through, taking him to dinner or something through Piccadilly. He kept asking me, why is everything so hard and tough? And I said, well, you know, it's a pretty tough town, things happen. And I walked him back to his hotel after dinner. There was a young man punching the windows out of a phone box, which I didn't think was physically possible, but we watched him do it. And I explained to him that as we were working with Tadeo Ando on the pavilion, he'd wanted to leave lots of cobbles around the building, loose cobbles, scattered around the building, and Jim and I and many others spent many hours talking him out of it. He wasn't having it to start with, and ammunition in another language, I think. So, but you know, Piccadilly Gardens every now and again turns into a sorry state, gets recovered, but you know, it is, I think, ultimately about how do you find what people want, how do you create the spaces for them to do things, don't over-prescribe it, but critically, can you afford to look after it afterwards? And therein lies a challenge with all public realm. I know Martha will touch on that a bit later. So look, we had the huge good fortune to almost become honorary Mancunians for a long period of time. What people may not really know here is that there is a constant exchange of ideas between these cities, and people are constantly coming to Manchester to look at it. I've just spent some time this morning with a team from Barcelona. Everyone goes to Barcelona to look at that. But the number of people who come through Manchester, and why do they come to Manchester? Because they see it as, in effect, a reality check, to some extent to regenerate Broadway in New York, or to do the LA waterfront, to do Venice Beach. You know, at one hand, yeah, it's quite difficult, but it's a bit like falling off a log compared to doing a post-industrial city somewhere. So what you get after you've been working on something like Manchester is a series of phone calls, which is, can you come and have a look at our city? And that's not just people like me, that's the city and everything. And the lessons learned from the city, I think, have been extraordinary. So this was one we took away afterwards, which was Sao Paulo. And as you know, big city. They finally decided they can't get any wider. They need to start backfilling the middle. And what I liked about this one was that their model in their minds was Manchester. They'd spent ages looking at Manchester. They'd obviously been here tons of times. I don't know if anyone met them, but they were here. They were observing. They'd hired people out of local design schools. They kind of got this place, and they wanted the same approach. And this was 40 city blocks. This is probably 4 or 5 times the area that we've been looking at in Manchester. 3,000 people living in city centre favelas. City centre favela in this piece is tower blocks with no services, so good view from the top floor, long climb up, no lifts. Very ugly if you live on the bottom floor, for all the reasons you would expect. This was about mafia. This is called Crackerlandia, this place. So it's drugs, prostitution, you name it. The first public meeting we went to, 3,000 people rioted. We were on a stage like this with riot police with their shields. Policeman next to me pulled a gun in the middle of my presentation, which I always thought added a little bit of... that's the most exciting time I'm ever going to have in my life, anyway. But what was interesting, and we ended up convening with the mayor the next morning, and his team going, what the hell went wrong? The whole meeting was abandoned, we all left the room. What was interesting was that, what had they missed out? They hadn't talked to anyone. And what I think is, what has been interesting about reflecting back on Manchester is that there's always a dialogue going on here. There's always a sense that there's a large number of people in the debate. Now, people may not feel that they're always being heard, but you always get the sense that, despite some of the points we've heard earlier, that there is a connection between the people and the leadership to some extent. And what became readily apparent in a pretty frightening way in this project in Sao Paulo was that nobody in city leadership had any idea what was going on and what people really felt about it. We had a riot on our hands. So we reconvened. The whole project was changed, not in terms of content, but in terms of how you talk to people. How do you run a debate with a community? How do you run a debate with a group of people, some of whom are very poor, feel separated from the levers of control? How do you actually reflect and work on behalf of the people you apparently represent? And what I've kind of learned from my early work in this city and repeated work is that this is a very connected city. There are lots of conversations going on, but those conversations tend to find their way into the right circles. You know, meetings like this, they get listened to, that message gets back up. That message, people attend, people listen. But the disconnected city, the city that is not connected to its people, the city that is doing things out with the desire of its city, frankly is doomed at that point. And So what did we do in this one? We set up these big community consultation groups. We analyzed both the people who were living there and what their voice needed to be and what voice they wanted to have. We also discussed and talked to the people we'd expect to move into an area like this, and we got a conversation going. Ultimately, the scheme as delivered, the scheme as been planned, in its physical sense, is probably not very different. But the occupation and ownership of that project will be very different. And I think that idea of connection, so for instance, an architectural, this is the old Art Deco center of Sao Paulo, you know. The restoration of the Art Deco buildings, the cinemas, this is Nova Luz, this area, becomes a fundamental part of the project going forward. I, for one, would say, as a visitor, that I have really no place in the design of this outcome. I can help you with a process, but the design should be of the place. Their previous solution to resolving this was to have an international design competition for a ballet school. You can all Google who won that one. But the point being is, what the hell did that have to do with resolving, you know, this place of great misfortune? And lesson I think that, again, I took from Manchester, that when we're talking to city authorities, is this whole point about connection. Do you understand who you're talking to? Are the forums in place to have the discussion? And do you know how to translate those very diverse viewpoints into a real debate about the city and where you take it forward? I must say, over the years, I've become way less interested in product and more about the connection with the people involved. So, Olympics. So we did the Olympics in London, a Sisyphean task if there ever was one, but it seemed to work at the end of the day. Again, very interesting, an edge city condition, the Lee Valley, primarily a place of bus garages, train storage, football stadiums, disused gasworks, recycling industries. Very few people living there, but a lot of the informal economy of the adjacent communities based there. By this time, I think a lot of lessons learned about how you disinter and look at one of these sort of places. And it's not unlike the challenges that actually Manchester faces on its fringes. Manchester faces in the Medlock Valley, Manchester faces in many places. How do you take places of extreme poverty and low value? Because you might argue that in any city in the world, doing the city centre, whilst technically difficult, financially difficult, you know, ultimately it's likely to work. These are big economic engines, you can get stuff to happen. But when you start moving into the poorer parts of the city, so where we were is, that would put it in the bottom 5% of the sort of economic and social indicators for the UK, we're putting the bottom 7% for Europe. So we're talking poor places, we're talking places where 150 different languages are spoken in the local primary schools, where there is complete detachment from the political systems, the engagement systems. There are communities that you just can't reach. These are the places of high turnover. And I think for all our cities now is this next wave. It's the sort of Detroit challenge. It's the Brooklyn waterfront challenge. It's the fringe Sao Paulo challenge, and it will be Manchester's challenge. How do you connect with the edge? Because that's where the populations are with the real life life opportunity challenges. And Olympic Games is one way of doing it. I wouldn't recommend it as the only way. You know, it's big and expensive, and it wasn't very popular. I love the fact that the day after the official graphics and logo for the Olympics was launched, you know, somebody had already taken them over. But I think the other thing that I really took from Manchester into these projects was the city here has always had, I think, and this probably has something to do with the stability of leadership, is a very clear idea, I think, about where the city's going. There has been a plan, and I've heard many times, you know, governments come up with different funding mechanisms. That doesn't mean you have to take it. You have a plan, you have an outcome that you're looking for, go with it. Don't do this all over the place. There are enough cities out there that have chased this fad and that fad. Think long, think hard, and stick to the plan. And again, one of the things we tried to impress on this London project was understand what's coming over the next 20 or 30 years, which in the case of this part of London is 2 cities the size of Sheffield in the next 25 years. Put your project, this minor thing called an Olympic Games, in the context of a really big idea. And I think that again is where Manchester has done well, in that it's stood back, it's thought about the big audacious plan, and it's stuck to its guns through hell or high water. Look at Manchester's recovery rate post the recession compared to the other provincial cities in the UK. It's absolutely phenomenal. And why is it like that? It's like that because people trust that there will be an outcome and there will be leadership that will stick to the plan. So our ambition, and I think this always has to be the ambition, that if you take the old Abercrombie plans from London from 1943, I love the fact that in 1943 they were kind of imagining where the city would be over the next 30. We're going to win the war and then we'll just, sort it out afterwards. But the Abercrombie plan basically coloured all the lovely bits around Kensington in orange and red to say this is the place of value and good life. And we just said, well, that surely should be your ambition for the East End of London. Surely that outcome should be what you're aiming for. That outcome should be about the normality of school provision, quality of housing, quality of policing, quality of local services, a choice about jobs. If you just get that right, then it'll look like the West End in terms of people's appreciation of place. And of course, it was some years later they declared the Olympic Park as a royal park. The scheme itself, again, think about centre of Manchester, think about the time it takes to do these things. By time you finish the last building, you're usually knocking the first one down. The cycle of land reuse in our cities is getting ever shorter. So look at Canary Wharf. Other than the big tower they put in the middle, everything on the south side of the Canary Wharf that was built has all been knocked down since then and replaced by 50-storey towers. The pace of change, the ability to deliver true long-term icons as opposed to the factories of economic change and success, those two things need to be understood. So, for instance, in the Olympic Park, we designed both the facility and the legacy at the same time, and those two things are crossing over each other at the moment. And there are things we're going to keep that I don't expect to be there for more than 15, 20 years, because something more important will be required to replace them. But I think that's something we need to understand in the modern city context, that what is about permanence, and I think public realm is a huge part of that, the culture of the city is a huge piece of that, of course, but what is it about our fabric that we hold on to, and which is about our fabric that we, to some extent, will exchange for something better as time moves on. So people are waving diagrams at me and frowning that I'm taking too long, so I'll get quick. Finally, I'm going to finish on this slide, which is, again, something else I took from Manchester, and I just used the sequence of documents that went with the Olympic Park in London. Was the way that ambition gets raised. If on day one, let's say for the East End of London for the Olympics, a place where 70 master plans had been produced in this area and only one had been delivered in the past 10, so 70 public consultation exercises for one successful outcome. Here is a population that believe nothing you're going to say, and I'll admit that we knocked down the one scheme to build the Olympics, so that was even worse. To go in on day one and say we're going to hit this has no credibility. So part of, I think, the mechanism of city change and city development, which I think happens well in this city, is the constant revisiting of the ambition and the content of that ambition, and constantly raising the bar and the expectation. You can't sell the big shiny idea to people who've never even witnessed what that might be, but you can take people on a path. You need to know where you're going. You need to talk about what those potential outcomes are, but it's very hard to imagine some utopian outcome if your starting point is standing in the ditch. And what you've got to do is I think, craft a route to that. That's not a Machiavellian manipulation of anyone. It's a
awareness program in yourselves, which you need to go back in and ask the question, okay, so we got to this point, but what does that now make possible about where we go next? And have our people come with us? Has our culture changed? Is our economy still working? Did this actually include the people it needed to include? And I think events like this are great because 20 years after the bomb, here is a point of reflection. How did we do? I don't know. I think we got some of it fairly right. The city seems to be in pretty good shape compared to some of our regional counterparts. But can you do better? Of course you can. This is city making. They change. This is a complete reflection of the human condition is what we do in cities. And that ability to stand back and reflect, which I think things like conferences like this are about, is something hugely important. So I would just finish on, I think this city is hugely influential to a much broader global audience than you might think, that a lot of us have taken lessons from here elsewhere. But the most important thing we can do is look back at ourselves, learn our own lessons, be self-critical, and then re-examine what we've done so we do the next bit right first time. I'll finish there. Thank you.